In a world where physical strength often defines capability, where muscles and size determine respect, and where the toughest warriors are measured by their ability to endure pain and overcome impossible odds, one woman was about to shatter every assumption the military's elite forces had ever held. What happened in those 9 seconds didn't just change the course of a training exercise. It didn't just silence a room full of skeptics. Those 9 seconds rewrote the rulebook on what true power really means, leaving even the most hardened Navy SEALs questioning everything they thought they knew about strength, strategy, and the unstoppable force of human determination. Some moments define us. Others redefine what we believe is possible. This is the story of both. Sara Martinez had never intended to become a legend. At 28 years old, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed less than most of the equipment the Navy SEALs carried on their backs during training missions. Her hands were small and calloused from years of rock climbing, her build lean rather than bulky, and her voice soft enough that people often asked her to repeat herself in crowded rooms. Nothing about her physical presence suggested she belonged among the most elite warriors in the world. But Sara had something that couldn't be measured in inches or pounds, something that didn't show up on fitness tests or psychological evaluations. She had an understanding of physics that bordered on instinct, a mind that calculated angles and leverage points faster than most people could blink, and a stubborn streak that had gotten her both into and out of more trouble than she cared to remember. Growing up in a small mountain town in Colorado, Sara had learned early that being the smallest person in the room meant getting creative about how to solve problems. When the other kids could reach the high shelves at the grocery store where she worked part-time, Sara learned to use stepladders efficiently. When her older brothers could lift heavy boxes that she couldn't budge, she figured out how to use dollies and leverage to move twice as much weight in half the time. When the boys at school challenged each other to arm wrestling contests, Sara discovered that understanding angles and using your opponent's strength against them could level any playing field. Her parents, both engineers who worked for an aerospace company, had encouraged her curiosity about how things worked. While other families watched movies on weekend evenings, the Martinez household often gathered around the kitchen table with broken appliances, mechanical puzzles, and physics problems that Sara's father brought home from work. Her mother taught her that every problem had multiple solutions, and the best one wasn't always the most obvious. Her father showed her that understanding the rules of physics could make seemingly impossible tasks become simple. By the time Sara graduated high school, she had already earned a reputation as someone who could fix anything that was broken and find solutions to problems that stumped everyone else. She won the state science fair 3 years running with projects that demonstrated how small forces could create massive results. Her senior project involved calculating the precise angle and force needed to move a car using nothing but a standard car jack and some basic physics principles. The demonstration left her physics teacher speechless and earned her a full scholarship to study mechanical engineering at Colorado State University. College introduced Sara to new challenges and new ways of thinking about problem solving. She excelled in her engineering courses, but found herself drawn to the physical challenges offered by the university's outdoor recreation program. Rock climbing became her passion, then her expertise. She loved the mental chess game of finding the most efficient route up a rock face, using technique and strategy to accomplish what others tried to achieve through pure strength and endurance. Her climbing partners were often men twice her size who could muscle their way up difficult routes through sheer power. Sara took a different approach. She studied each route like an engineering problem, identifying the keyholes that would provide maximum leverage, planning her moves several steps ahead, and using her understanding of body mechanics to climb routes that seemed impossible for someone her size. She became known for completing climbs that stronger, more experienced climbers couldn't finish, not because she was stronger, but because she was smarter about how she applied her strength. During her junior year, Sara's engineering professor recommended her for a summer internship with a defense contractor that designed equipment for special operations forces. The work involved solving complex problems related to how soldiers could carry and deploy heavy equipment in challenging environments. Sara found herself fascinated by the tactical challenges faced by elite military units and began to understand how the same principles she applied to rock climbing could be used to solve military logistics problems. Her internship supervisor was a former Army Ranger who had transitioned to civilian consulting work. He recognized something special. in Sarah's approach to problem solving and began sharing stories about the challenges faced by special operations teams in the field. Sarah learned about situations where conventional approaches failed, and creative thinking could mean the difference between mission success and failure. She began to understand that the military, despite its emphasis on physical strength and conventional tactics, faced many problems that required exactly the kind of innovative thinking she had developed. When Sarah graduated with her engineering degree, she faced a choice between a lucrative job with a private engineering firm and an opportunity to work directly with military special operations units as a civilian contractor. The private sector job offered better pay, more comfortable working conditions, and a predictable career path. The military contract work offered uncertainty, challenging conditions, and the opportunity to solve problems that could save lives. Sarah chose the military contract work. Her first assignment brought her to Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California, where she was tasked with evaluating and improving the equipment used by Navy SEAL teams. The work was fascinating, but frustrating. She quickly discovered that many of the tools and techniques used by the teams were based on tradition and conventional wisdom rather than optimal engineering principles. Equipment was often heavier than necessary, procedures were more complicated than required, and solutions to common problems were often overlooked because they didn't fit traditional military thinking. The SEALs she worked with were professional and respectful, but Sarah could sense their skepticism. She was a civilian, a woman, and someone who had never served in the military. What could she possibly understand about their challenges that they didn't already know? Some were openly doubtful about whether someone who had never carried a heavy pack through hostile territory could design better equipment for those who did it regularly. Others were more diplomatic but equally skeptical about whether theoretical knowledge could translate to practical improvements in real-world conditions. Sarah understood their doubts and didn't take them personally. She had faced similar skepticism from climbing partners who assumed that her small size meant limited capability, and from classmates who questioned whether a woman could succeed in a male-dominated engineering field. She had learned that the best way to overcome skepticism was through demonstrated results rather than arguments or explanations. She began by observing training exercises and asking questions about the challenges the teams faced. She listened carefully to their complaints about equipment that was too heavy, procedures that were too complicated, and situations where conventional approaches created unnecessary difficulties. She took notes, made sketches, and began to see patterns in the problems they described. One of the most common complaints involved a training exercise where team members had to traverse a series of obstacles while carrying heavy equipment. The exercise was designed to test strength, endurance, and teamwork. But Sarah noticed that most teams approached it the same way every time, using brute force methods that exhausted them unnecessarily and often resulted in equipment damage or injury. Sarah spent several weeks studying the exercise, timing different approaches, and calculating the physics involved in each obstacle. She began to see how small changes in technique could dramatically reduce the effort required and increase the likelihood of success. But she also understood that suggesting changes to a training program that had been used for years would require more than theoretical calculations. She would need to demonstrate that her ideas actually worked under real conditions. The opportunity came during a monthly evaluation exercise where civilian contractors were invited to observe SEAL team training. Sarah had watched the exercise several times and had developed specific ideas about how it could be approached more efficiently. She had run calculations, created diagrams, and even built small-scale models to test her theories. But she had never attempted the actual exercise herself. The training officer in charge of the exercise was Commander James Harrison, a career Navy officer who had spent 15 years with SEAL teams before taking on his current role. Harrison was known for his fairness and his willingness to listen to new ideas, but he was also protective of the traditions and standards that had made the SEALs effective. He had worked with several civilian contractors over the years and had seen both valuable innovations and impractical suggestions that looked good on paper but failed under real conditions. Sarah approached Commander Harrison after watching a particularly difficult training session where two teams had failed to complete the exercise within the allotted time. Both teams had approached the obstacles using conventional methods, and both had been defeated by a combination of equipment, weight, time pressure, and the cumulative fatigue that came from inefficient techniques. She explained her observations and her ideas for alternative approaches. Commander Harrison listened politely but remained skeptical. The exercise had been designed by experienced operators who understood the physical and mental challenges faced by SEAL teams in combat. Changing it based on theoretical calculations from someone who had never attempted it herself seemed risky at best, but Sarah had anticipated this response. She didn't ask Commander Harrison to change the exercise based on her theories. Instead, she made a different request. She asked for permission to attempt the exercise herself, using the techniques she had developed to demonstrate whether her ideas had practical value under real conditions. The request surprised Commander Harrison and several of the SEAL team members who were present for the conversation. The exercise was physically demanding even for trained operators, and Sarah was a civilian contractor who had never undergone military training. Allowing her to attempt it could result in injury, embarrassment, or both. But it would also provide a clear test of whether her ideas had merit. After considering the risks and potential benefits, Commander Harrison agreed to let Sarah attempt a modified version of the exercise. The obstacles would remain the same, but she would not be required to carry the full load of equipment that SEAL team members typically used. She would also be accompanied by safety personnel who could intervene if she encountered difficulties. Sarah accepted these conditions but made one additional request. She asked that her attempt be timed and evaluated using the same standards applied to SEAL teams, with only the equipment load being reduced. She wanted to demonstrate not just that her techniques could work, but that they could work efficiently enough to meet the performance standards expected of elite operators. Word spread quickly through the base that a civilian contractor was going to attempt the obstacle course that had challenged even experienced SEAL teams. Some viewed it as an interesting experiment that might provide useful insights. Others saw it as a publicity stunt that was likely to end in failure and embarrassment. A few were concerned that allowing a civilian to attempt the exercise might compromise the standards and traditions that made SEAL training effective. Sarah spent the week before her attempt preparing both physically and mentally. She had maintained her fitness through regular climbing and hiking, but she knew that the military exercise would challenge different muscle groups and require different types of endurance than her recreational activities. She spent time at the base gym working on functional strength exercises and practicing movements that would be required during the obstacle course. More importantly, she spent time refining her strategy for each obstacle. She created detailed plans that specified exactly how she would approach each challenge, what techniques she would use, and how she would transition between obstacles to maintain momentum and efficiency. She practiced key movements repeatedly until they became automatic, and she visualized the entire sequence until she could see herself completing it successfully. The night before her attempt, Sarah felt the familiar combination of nervousness and excitement that she had experienced before difficult climbing routes. She knew that she had prepared thoroughly and that her techniques were sound, but she also understood that real-world execution was always different from theory and practice. She would have only one opportunity to prove that her ideas worked, and failure would likely end any credibility she had built with the SEAL teams. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. She had never planned to challenge the methods used by elite military units, and she certainly had never imagined that she would find herself preparing to demonstrate her ideas in front of skeptical Navy SEALs. But she had learned throughout her life that the most important breakthroughs often came from questioning conventional approaches and being willing to test new ideas under real conditions. Tomorrow would prove whether years of studying physics and engineering principles, combined with a lifetime of solving problems through creativity rather than conventional strength, could translate to success in an environment designed to test the limits of human capability. Sarah fell asleep knowing that she was as prepared as she could be, and that 9 seconds of execution would soon determine whether her ideas had merit or whether she had overestimated her ability to bridge the gap between theory and practice. The morning of Sarah's attempt dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp air that made every sound seem sharper and every detail more vivid. By 7 o'clock, word had spread throughout the Naval Special Warfare Command about the civilian contractor who was going to attempt the obstacle course that had challenged even the most experienced SEAL teams. What had begun as a small demonstration for a few interested observers had grown into something much larger. Commander Harrison arrived at the training facility to find nearly 40 people gathered around the obstacle course. There were active-duty SEALs, training instructors, other civilian contractors, and even a few base personnel who had heard about the unusual event and managed to find reasons to be in the area. The attention made him slightly uncomfortable, as he had originally envisioned Sarah's attempt as a quiet evaluation of her theoretical ideas, rather than a public demonstration. Sarah arrived precisely at the scheduled time, carrying a small backpack that contained water, emergency medical supplies, and the modified equipment load that had been agreed upon. She wore simple athletic clothing rather than military gear, and her appearance emphasized how different she was from the operators who typically attempted this course. Several of the observers made quiet comments about her size and questioned whether the attempt was wise or even fair to the standards the course was designed to uphold. The obstacle course itself was a carefully designed sequence of challenges that tested different aspects of physical and mental capability. It began with a wall climb that required upper body strength and technique to surmount a 12-foot vertical barrier. This was followed by a rope traverse across a water obstacle, where operators had to maintain their grip and momentum while carrying equipment. Next came a series of low crawls under wire obstacles that tested endurance and the ability to move efficiently in confined spaces. The middle section of the course included a heavy carry challenge where participants had to transport equipment over uneven terrain for 300 yards, followed by a climbing wall with irregular handholds that required both strength and problem-solving skills. The course concluded with a final sprint to a designated finish line, where participants had to demonstrate that they retained enough energy and focus to complete their mission after overcoming all previous obstacles. The entire course was typically completed by SEAL teams in 12 to 15 minutes, with the fastest recorded time being just under 10 minutes. Teams that took longer than 20 minutes were considered to have failed the exercise, and individual operators who couldn't complete the course within the time limit faced additional training requirements. The course had been designed by experienced operators who understood the physical demands of special operations missions, and it had been refined over years of use to ensure that it accurately tested the capabilities needed for real-world operations. Sarah studied the course one final time, walking through each section and visualizing her planned approach. She had spent weeks analyzing every obstacle and calculating the most efficient methods for overcoming each challenge. Her strategy differed significantly from the conventional approaches used by SEAL teams, focusing on leverage and technique rather than brute strength, and emphasizing momentum and efficiency rather than raw power. At the wall climb, where most operators used upper body strength to pull themselves up and over, Sarah planned to use a technique borrowed from rock climbing that would allow her legs to do most of the work. She had identified specific foot positions that would create better leverage and reduce the energy required to reach the top. At the rope traverse, instead of using arm strength to pull herself across, she planned to use a modified technique that would engage her core muscles and maintain better balance. Commander Harrison called the group to attention and explained the parameters of Sarah's attempt. She would complete the same course used by SEAL teams, carrying a reduced equipment load but adhering to the same time standards and safety requirements. Her performance would be timed and evaluated objectively, and the results would provide data about whether alternative techniques could improve course completion times and success rates. Several of the SEAL team members present had mixed feelings about the demonstration. Some were genuinely curious about whether Sarah's engineering background could provide insights that would improve their training methods. Others were concerned that allowing a civilian to attempt their course might diminish the significance of completing it. A few were openly skeptical about whether someone who had never undergone military training could understand the mental and physical challenges that made the course difficult. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, a 15-year SEAL veteran who served as the primary training instructor for the course, had particular concerns about the demonstration. He had seen hundreds of operators attempt the course over the years, and he understood exactly what made it challenging. The obstacles were designed not just to test individual skills, but to create cumulative fatigue that would reveal an operator's ability to maintain performance under stress. He worried that focusing on individual techniques might miss the broader purpose of the exercise. But Chief Thompson also recognized that the best military units were those that remained open to new ideas and continuous improvement. He had seen innovations from unexpected sources prove valuable in both training and combat situations. If Sarah's techniques could genuinely improve performance or reduce the risk of injury, he wanted to evaluate them objectively, rather than dismissing them based on assumptions about her background. Sarah positioned herself at the starting line and took a final moment to center her focus. She had learned from years of climbing that the mental aspect of challenging physical tasks was often as important as the physical preparation. She visualized herself moving through each obstacle smoothly and efficiently, maintaining the rhythm and momentum that would be crucial for success. She reminded herself that she had prepared thoroughly and that her techniques were based on sound engineering principles rather than guesswork or wishful thinking. At Commander Harrison's signal, Sarah began her attempt. She approached the wall climb with measured steps, reaching the base and immediately identifying the foot position she had planned. Instead of jumping up to grab the top of the wall, as most operators did, she placed her hands at specific points that created better leverage. Her first step up was precisely positioned to maximize the power she could generate with her legs, and her second step brought her high enough to reach the top without requiring a pull-up motion that would exhaust her upper body strength. The observers watched in surprise as Sarah smoothly surmounted the wall, using what appeared to be minimal effort. Her technique looked almost effortless compared to the explosive burst of strength typically required, and she maintained momentum that carried her over the top, without the pause that most operators needed to gather strength for the final pull-up. Her time for the first obstacle was already several seconds faster than average. At the rope traverse, Sarah's approach was even more unconventional. Instead of gripping the rope with both hands and pulling herself across hand over hand, she used a technique that engaged her entire body. She positioned herself with one hand forward and one back, using a diagonal body position that distributed weight more efficiently and allowed her legs to contribute to forward momentum. The technique required more coordination than the conventional approach, but it was significantly less tiring and allowed her to maintain speed throughout the crossing. Chief Thompson found himself leaning forward to watch more closely. Sarah's technique was unlike anything he had seen in 15 years of observing operators attempt the course. It wasn't just different, it was demonstrably more efficient. She was moving faster than most operators, while appearing to expend less energy, and her unconventional approaches were clearly based on thoughtful analysis rather than random experimentation. The low crawl section provided another opportunity for Sarah to demonstrate the value of her analytical approach. Most operators treated this obstacle as a test of endurance, maintaining a steady pace that would allow them to complete the section without exhausting themselves. Sarah had calculated that short bursts of speed separated by brief recovery periods would actually be less tiring overall and would result in faster completion times. She moved through the crawl section in a pattern of quick advances followed by momentary pauses, covering the distance significantly faster than the steady-state approach used by most operators. By the time Sarah reached the heavy carry section, which most participants found to be the most challenging part of the course, she had built a substantial time advantage over typical completion times. More importantly, she appeared to be less fatigued than operators usually were at this point in the course. Her efficient techniques had conserved energy that was now available for the demanding middle section of the exercise. The heavy carry challenge required participants to transport equipment weighing 60 pounds over 300 yards of uneven terrain. The conventional approach was to lift the equipment and carry it in the most comfortable position possible, accepting that the weight would create increasing fatigue as the distance increased. Sarah had developed a different strategy based on her understanding of biomechanics and load distribution. Instead of lifting the equipment to a carrying position, Sarah used a technique that allowed her to roll and slide the load across the ground while maintaining forward momentum. She had identified the optimal angle and rhythm for this approach through careful analysis of the terrain and the physical properties of the equipment. The technique required precise timing and coordination, but it dramatically reduced the energy required to transport the load across the required distance. The observers watched in fascination as Sarah moved through the heavy carry section using her unconventional technique. She was maintaining a pace that matched or exceeded typical completion times, while clearly expending less energy than operators who carried the load in traditional ways. Some of the SEAL team members began commenting quietly to each other about the potential applications of her approach in real-world operations, where conserving energy could be crucial for mission success. Commander Harrison found himself reconsidering his initial skepticism about Sarah's theories. Watching her performance, he could see that her techniques weren't just academic exercises or theoretical improvements. They were practical applications of engineering principles that resulted in measurable performance gains. The question was whether these techniques could be taught effectively to operators who were accustomed to conventional approaches, and whether they would remain effective under the stress and chaos of actual combat conditions. As Sarah approached the climbing wall section, she had maintained her time advantage and appeared to be in better condition than most operators at this point in the course. The climbing wall was designed to test both physical capability and problem-solving skills, with irregular handholds that required participants to adapt their technique to the available options. Most operators approached this obstacle by studying the available handholds and planning a route that would allow them to reach the top using upper body strength and determination. Sarah's approach to the climbing wall drew on years of rock climbing experience and her understanding of efficient movement techniques. Instead of planning a single route to the top, she had identified multiple possible paths and had developed decision criteria that would allow her to adapt her route based on her energy level and the specific conditions she encountered. She began climbing using a technique that emphasized balance and precision over strength, flowing smoothly from one handhold to another in a way that minimized energy expenditure. The climbing wall had been designed to challenge even experienced operators, with several handholds positioned to create difficult transitions that would test grip strength and endurance. Sarah navigated these challenges using techniques that distributed the load across multiple muscle groups and maintained body positions that reduced strain on any single area. Her movement up the wall looked almost graceful compared to the determined struggle that characterized most attempts. As Sarah reached the top of the climbing wall, Chief Thompson realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented. Her time to this point was faster than any individual completion he had observed in his years of running the course. More significantly, her techniques were clearly superior to conventional approaches in terms of both speed and energy conservation. If these methods could be integrated into SEAL training programs, they might significantly improve both training outcomes and operational effectiveness. The final section of the course was a sprint to the finish line that tested whether participants retained enough energy and focus to complete their mission after overcoming all previous obstacles. This was often where operators who had pushed too hard in earlier sections discovered that they had insufficient reserves for the final push. Sarah approached the sprint section with energy reserves that most operators had already exhausted, and her final time was faster than anyone had anticipated. When Commander Harrison announced Sarah's completion time, the group of observers fell silent. She had not just completed the course within the required time limit, she had set a new record that was nearly 2 minutes faster than the previous best individual performance. More importantly, she had demonstrated techniques that could potentially improve the performance and reduce the injury risk for SEAL team members who used the course for training. But the most significant moment came during the 9 seconds immediately following Sarah's completion of the course. As she crossed the finish line, instead of collapsing or showing signs of exhaustion, as most operators did, Sarah turned back toward the course and began explaining to the gathered observers exactly how each technique had worked and why it had been more efficient than conventional approaches. Chief Thompson approached Sarah and asked her to demonstrate specific techniques more slowly so that he could understand exactly what she had done differently. As she explained the physics behind each approach and showed how small modifications to conventional techniques could yield significant improvements, the SEAL team members present began to realize that they were not just watching a successful completion of their training course. They were receiving instruction from someone who understood aspects of physical performance that they had never considered. The 9 seconds during which Sarah transitioned from course completion to technical instruction changed the entire dynamic of the gathering. What had begun as a demonstration to test theoretical ideas became an impromptu training session, where experienced operators found themselves learning new techniques from a civilian contractor who had just outperformed their best recorded times. Commander Harrison found himself facing a decision that would have significant implications for SEAL training programs. Sarah had clearly demonstrated that her techniques were not just theoretical improvements, but practical applications that could enhance operational effectiveness. The question was how to integrate these insights into established training programs without compromising the standards and traditions that had made SEAL teams effective. As the group dispersed, several SEAL team members approached Sarah privately to ask more detailed questions about specific techniques. They wanted to understand not just how to replicate her performance, but how to adapt her methods to their own physical capabilities and operational requirements. The conversation that began during those 9 seconds after course completion continued informally for hours, as operators discovered that questioning conventional approaches could lead to significant improvements in both individual and team performance. Sarah had proven that her engineering background and analytical approach to problem-solving could translate to success in an environment designed to test the limits of human capability. But more importantly, she had demonstrated that innovation and improvement were possible, even in organizations with strong traditions and proven methods. The 9 seconds that proved her power had also opened new possibilities for enhancing the capabilities of the most elite warriors in the world. The impact of Sarah's performance extended far beyond the single training exercise that had captured everyone's attention. In the days following her record-breaking completion of the obstacle course, word spread throughout the Naval Special Warfare community about the civilian contractor who had revolutionized their understanding of physical performance and tactical efficiency. What had begun as a simple demonstration of alternative techniques had evolved into something much more significant. A fundamental challenge to conventional thinking about how elite operators could maximize their capabilities. Commander Harrison found himself fielding calls from training officers at other SEAL teams who had heard about Sarah's performance and wanted to understand exactly what had happened. The story had grown with each telling, and Harrison realized that he needed to document the specific techniques Sarah had used and evaluate their potential for broader implementation. He scheduled a series of follow-up sessions where Sarah would work directly with SEAL training instructors to analyze her methods and develop protocols for teaching them to other operators. The first of these sessions took place 3 days after Sarah's initial demonstration, in a conference room at the Naval Special Warfare Command headquarters. Present were Commander Harrison, Chief Petty Officer Thompson, 2 other senior training instructors, and a Navy physical therapist who specialized in injury prevention for special operations personnel. Sarah arrived with a detailed presentation that she had prepared over the previous 72 hours, complete with physics calculations, biomechanical analyses, and video footage of her course completion that had been recorded from multiple angles. Sarah began her presentation by explaining the fundamental principle that had guided all of her technique modifications. The idea that most physical challenges could be approached more efficiently by understanding the underlying physics and biomechanics rather than simply applying maximum effort. She demonstrated how small changes in body position, timing, and force planning could result in dramatic improvements in both performance and energy conservation. Using the wall climb as her first example, Sarah showed how the conventional approach of jumping up to grab the top of the wall and pulling oneself over required operators to lift their entire body weight using only their arms. Her alternative technique used leg strength, which was typically much greater than arm strength, to do most of the work. The modification required operators to position their hands at specific points that created better leverage, allowing their legs to push them up rather than requiring their arms to pull them over. Chief Thompson, who had been initially skeptical about civilian involvement in SEAL training, found himself taking detailed notes as Sarah explained the biomechanics behind her approach. He had observed thousands of operators attempt the wall climb over his career, and he had seen many struggle with the upper body strength requirements. Sarah's technique offered a way to make the obstacle more accessible to operators with different physical capabilities while also reducing the energy expenditure required for completion. The Navy physical therapist was particularly interested in Sarah's analysis of injury risk associated with conventional techniques. She explained how the explosive movements typically used at the wall climb created high stress loads on shoulder and elbow joints, contributing to the overuse injuries that were common among SEAL trainees. Her modified technique distributed forces more evenly across multiple muscle groups and joints, potentially reducing injury risk while improving performance. Sarah continued through each obstacle on the course, providing detailed explanations of the physics principles behind her modifications and demonstrating how conventional approaches could be improved through better understanding of leverage, momentum, and energy conservation. Her analysis of the rope traverse showed how proper body positioning could reduce grip strength requirements by 60% while actually increasing crossing speed. Her heavy carry technique demonstrated how understanding friction and load distribution could allow operators to transport equipment with significantly less energy expenditure. As the presentation progressed, the training instructors began asking increasingly detailed questions about how Sarah's techniques could be adapted for different physical capabilities and operational requirements. They wanted to understand whether her methods would work for operators who were taller or shorter than she was, whether the techniques would remain effective when carrying heavier loads, and how they might perform under the stress and fatigue conditions typical of actual combat operations. Sarah had anticipated these questions and had prepared answers based on her engineering analysis of the underlying principles. She explained that her techniques were based on fundamental physics laws that applied regardless of an individual's specific physical characteristics, although the exact implementation might need to be adjusted based on factors like height, weight, and strength. She had also considered how the techniques might be modified for different equipment loads and operational scenarios. Commander Harrison realized that they were discussing something much more significant than simple modifications to a training exercise. Sarah's analytical approach represented a fundamentally different way of thinking about physical performance optimization that could have applications throughout SEAL training programs and operational procedures. The question was how to evaluate and implement these concepts systematically rather than simply adopting them based on the results of a single demonstration. Over the following weeks, a more formal evaluation process was established. Sarah worked directly with SEAL training teams to teach her techniques to active duty operators and evaluate their effectiveness under various conditions. The initial results were encouraging. Operators who learned Sarah's methods showed consistent improvements in course completion times and reported less fatigue after completing training exercises. But the most significant developments came when the techniques were tested under more realistic conditions that simulated actual combat scenarios. SEAL teams that incorporated Sarah's efficiency principles into their movement and equipment handling procedures found that they could maintain higher performance levels for longer periods during extended operations. Teams that used conventional approaches often experienced performance degradation after several hours of continuous operation, while teams using Sarah's techniques maintained effectiveness significantly longer. The success of these evaluations led to Sarah being offered a permanent position as a training development specialist with Naval Special Warfare Command. Her role would involve analyzing existing training procedures and operational techniques to identify opportunities for improvement through better application of engineering principles. She would work directly with SEAL teams to develop and test new approaches, and she would help establish protocols for teaching improved techniques to current and future operators. Sarah accepted the position with excitement and some trepidation. She understood that her success with a single training exercise had created expectations that might be difficult to meet in other areas, but she also recognized that she had found her true calling, applying her analytical skills and engineering background to help elite operators maximize their capabilities and improve their chances of mission success. Her first major project in her new role involved analyzing the equipment and procedures used by SEAL teams during water infiltration operations. These missions required operators to swim long distances while carrying equipment, often in challenging environmental conditions. The conventional approaches had been developed over decades of experience and had proven effective, but Sarah's analysis suggested that significant improvements were possible through better understanding of hydrodynamics and load distribution in water environments. Working with experienced operators, Sarah studied how equipment design and carrying techniques affected swimming efficiency and energy expenditure during long-distance infiltrations. She discovered that small modifications to equipment positioning and swimming techniques could reduce energy requirements by up to 30% without compromising mission capabilities. The improvements were particularly significant for longer missions, where energy conservation was crucial for maintaining operational effectiveness. The success of Sarah's water infiltration analysis led to additional projects involving land navigation techniques, equipment handling procedures, and tactical movement methods. In each case, her engineering approach identified opportunities for improvement that had been overlooked by conventional analysis. More importantly, her techniques were proving effective not just in controlled training environments, but in operational scenarios where performance improvements could mean the difference between mission success and failure. As Sarah's reputation grew within the special operations community, she began receiving requests for assistance from other military units beyond the Navy SEALs, Army Special Forces, Marine reconnaissance teams, and Air Force Special Operations units. All wanted to understand how her analytical approach could be applied to their specific challenges and requirements. Sarah found herself traveling to different bases and training facilities, working with diverse groups of elite operators who faced different but related performance optimization challenges. The most rewarding aspect of Sarah's work was seeing how her techniques were adapted and improved by the operators who used them. She had expected that her engineering analysis would provide useful starting points for improvement, but she discovered that experienced operators could take her basic principles and develop applications that she had never considered. The combination of her analytical approach and their operational experience created innovations that neither could have achieved independently. 6 months after her record-breaking completion of the SEAL obstacle course, Sarah was invited to present her methodology at a special operations conference, attended by training officers and operational commanders from throughout the U.S. military. Her presentation focused not just on the specific techniques she had developed, but on the broader principles of applying engineering analysis to performance optimization challenges. The audience included some of the most experienced special operations personnel in the world, many of whom had initially been skeptical about whether civilian contractors could contribute meaningfully to military training and operational effectiveness. Sarah's presentation demonstrated how systematic analysis could identify improvement opportunities that had been hidden by conventional approaches and established traditions. During the question and answer session following her presentation, a senior Army Special Forces officer asked Sarah what she considered to be the most important lesson from her work with SEAL teams. Her answer surprised many in the audience. She explained that the most significant discovery had not been any specific technique or procedure, but rather the recognition that even the most elite and experienced organizations could benefit from questioning conventional approaches and remaining open to new ideas. Sarah described how the 9 seconds immediately following her completion of the obstacle course had been more important than the record-breaking performance itself. During those 9 seconds, she had transitioned from being someone trying to prove a point to being someone sharing knowledge with colleagues who were genuinely interested in improvement. The SEAL team members who had initially been skeptical had become collaborative partners in developing better methods, and their operational experience had been essential for transforming theoretical improvements into practical applications. The conference presentation established Sarah as a recognized expert in performance optimization for special operations forces, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in her career. Instead of working primarily with individual teams or units, she began developing systematic approaches that could be applied across different organizations and operational environments. Her goal was to create frameworks that would allow military units to conduct their own analyses and identify improvement opportunities specific to their unique challenges and requirements. Sarah's influence extended beyond military applications, as her techniques and analytical approaches began to be adopted in civilian contexts. Emergency response teams, search and rescue organizations, and law enforcement agencies discovered that her methods for optimizing physical performance under stress could be valuable for their operations. Athletic coaches and trainers found that her engineering approach to movement efficiency could help athletes improve their performance while reducing injury risk. But perhaps the most significant impact of Sarah's work was the cultural change it represented within the special operations community. Her success had demonstrated that innovation and improvement were possible even in organizations with strong traditions and proven methods. More importantly, it had shown that the best innovations often came from combining different perspectives and areas of expertise, rather than relying solely on experience within a single domain. The 9 seconds that had proven Sarah's power had also proven something else, that true strength came not from rigid adherence to conventional approaches, but from the willingness to question assumptions, embrace new ideas, and continuously seek better ways to achieve important objectives. The Navy SEALs, who had initially been stunned by Sarah's performance, had become advocates for the analytical approach she represented, and they had helped establish new standards for how elite military units could pursue continuous improvement. Years later, when Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her from a small mountain town in Colorado to a career optimizing performance for the world's most elite warriors, she realized that the most important factor had not been her engineering education or her analytical skills. It had been her willingness to challenge conventional thinking and her persistence in pursuing ideas that others might have dismissed as impractical or impossible. The story of the 9 seconds that proved her power had become a legend within the special operations community, but Sarah understood that the real significance lay in what had happened in the months and years that followed. The techniques she had demonstrated were important, but they were less significant than the mindset shift they had represented. The recognition that performance could always be improved through better understanding and more thoughtful approaches had become embedded in the culture of organizations that had previously relied primarily on tradition and experience. Sarah's legacy was not just the specific improvements she had developed, but the demonstration that innovation was possible in any environment where people were willing to question assumptions, combine different areas of expertise, and remain open to new ideas. The 9 seconds that had stunned the Navy SEALs had ultimately transformed how elite military units approached the challenge of maximizing human performance under the most demanding conditions imaginable.